There are two main areas that we want to pay attention to in relation to mistakes and your game. The first is how you view mistakes going into a game, and the second is how you handle mistakes when they do happen. So let's start with that first part, how you view mistakes going into a game. The way you view mistakes going into a game, and this is also going to apply to practice as well, right? So the way you view mistakes going into practice will have a large impact on either the confidence you play with or the fear and anxiety you play with. So when you go into games, and you view mistakes as purely negative, purely something that you want to avoid, this leads to an avoidance mindset that's based in fear, where you say, I don't want to make a certain mistake, right? I don't want mistakes to happen, therefore I'm going to avoid making those mistakes. Now, why would you go into games with so much fear and so much avoidance surrounding mistakes? Well, this is going to be because of the consequences of the mistakes, right? And so I talk about this a lot in videos where I'm talking about the fear of failure, because the fear of failure, also the fear of making mistakes, is all about the fear of the consequences of making mistakes. You turn the ball over, you get benched. You strike out, you let your team down, your stats drop, right? So we see that there's a mistake, and then after the mistake, as a result of the mistake, we see a consequence occur. It's the consequence that you want to avoid. Now, going into a game, what do you think happens the more your mind focuses on those consequences? The more your mind sees mistakes as something negative. What happens to fear and what happens to anxiety? Fear will increase because you're giving attention to the consequences that you want to avoid. When you give attention to the consequences you want to avoid, naturally you become afraid and you grow scared of that consequence happening. You know, a prime example of this is a baseball player I'm working with right now who's feeling fear surrounding making bad throws because he doesn't want to get benched and lose his starting position. So now all of a sudden making throws, and most importantly making a bad throw, has become something that he thinks about a lot and something that he fears a lot. So he views making bad throws as purely a negative thing. And not just a negative thing, but the very thing that could take him off of the field. Now, whether that's true or not, that's a different story. And the truth is, a lot of the fears that you have, a lot of the consequences that could happen, they might happen. Like if he's making some bad throws, he might get benched. If you play poorly game after game after game, you might get benched too, right? So we know that those consequences are real. However, what we're talking about right now is how you view the consequences. Just because a consequence might happen does not mean that you have to be afraid of it. In fact, if a consequence could happen, you have to work to not be afraid of it, because if you are afraid of that consequence happening, we see your play change as a result. So the baseball player that I was mentioning, he's struggling with his throws purely because of the fear. The fear of making a bad throw is causing him to throw tense, timidly, and change his throw mechanics simply due to that fear, because of the way he's viewing this mistake in the first place. Another example is a soccer player who I've worked with in the past, where she was feeling very scared of making mistakes. So she saw mistakes as a negative, right? She saw mistakes as a reason for teammates to think that she wasn't good, coaches to think that she wasn't good. And so what happened was she found herself holding herself back during games. She wouldn't call for the ball as much. When it came to going 1v1 against somebody and trying to win the ball back, she wouldn't go as aggressively. All of this change in play stemmed from the initial view of mistakes. She saw mistakes as something negative. For yourself, how do you view mistakes right now? Are you viewing mistakes as something purely negative within your game? A reason for you to feel down on yourself, a reason for other people to not think that you're a good player, a reason for you to get benched? Now, once again, even if all of that is true, we have to be careful with the way you are thinking about and viewing mistakes in the first place, because we know that when you view mistakes in a certain way, especially when you view mistakes as a way to, or as a fearful thing, and so as a reason or something that you need to avoid, when you view mistakes like that, we see fear of failure and anxiety increase, and then we see play decrease, right? You're going to see your performance drop as a result. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. I just wanted to take a moment to explain two resources that I have for you. One is a free training on the top 5 mental mistakes athletes make, and the other is a free training if you're a parent of a young athlete on how to help them build mental toughness. Both trainings are linked in the description below. Now let's get back to the video. So that's the effect of viewing mistakes as something to fear, something to avoid, something to worry about has on your game. It will lower your performance due to the tension, the stress, and the timidness that it creates. Now, what about during games? What about during games when you respond poorly to a mistake? So let's say you get mad about a mistake. If you get mad about a mistake during a game, what kind of effect does that have on your play? Well, that's going to do a couple things, right? First off, it's going to affect the focus that you have for the next play. The next play, you won't be as locked in. You might not be as confident simply because of the frustration that you feel as a result of the previous mistake. Now, as this happens time and time and time again, what will occur is that the frustration you feel in response to the mistake will feed back into the fear you have about making further mistakes in the future. Not only because you don't want to feel so frustrated again, but also if you notice that this frustration negatively impacts your play, you want to avoid the frustration. And what's the way to avoid the frustration? Avoiding the mistake in the first place. So then we see this feedback and create a loop where once more you are afraid and you are trying to avoid mistakes, which, as we already discussed, only lowers your performance. Another way that you can respond to mistakes in a poor way that affects your performance is by thinking about the mistake so much because you wish it hadn't happened, right? You think, oh, I wish I hadn't made that mistake. If only I had done this, if I had done this differently or that differently, maybe I wouldn't have made the mistake. That might seem like a productive way of thinking in the moment because you feel like you're learning from the mistake. But you have to ask yourself, are you really learning anything? Or are you simply getting down on yourself and getting stuck on the mistake and not allowing yourself to move past the mistake and to refocus for the next play? There is time for learning, and you need to be able to adjust from mistakes. But adjusting from mistakes in games has to happen quickly. That doesn't mean you need to think about, why did this happen? If I had done this differently or if I had done that differently, then maybe I wouldn't have made the mistake. That's not what it means to adjust. What it means to adjust mid-game is thinking, okay, what can I learn from that? All right, I got this one piece. Okay, now let's refocus. It's a quick process, especially if you're playing a fast game like basketball or soccer, or even football where you're getting back up to the next play, or baseball where you have to refocus for the next pitch. You cannot be hung up on the previous mistake. And then after games, the way you respond to mistakes is, you learn from them at that point and you think, how can I actually take what I learn and apply it during practice? If you get too frustrated with yourself after games, or if you get too down on yourself after games and just beat yourself up and beat yourself up and beat yourself up, and once more, you're only fueling fear. The more you think about the mistake after games, the longer you hold on to these mistakes after games, the more frustrated you are going to get with yourself. So the reason I wanted to break it down like this is because mistakes are such a natural part of sports, but they can have such a negative effect on your play simply because of the way you are viewing mistakes in the first place, but then also the way you respond and the way you react to mistakes. And I work with a lot of different athletes on sports performance anxiety and the fear of failure, and at the core of these two challenges is the way you see and respond to mistakes. If you see mistakes as something to fear and avoid, you're going to play timid, you're going to play tense, you're going to hold yourself back. If you respond poorly to mistakes, you're going to see your focus decrease, you're going to see the snowball effect happen, and you're going to make more and more mistakes throughout the game. But also after that game, especially if you get more frustrated at yourself for the remainder of the day or even days moving forward, this once more feeds back into that fear and it feeds back into that anxiety. So knowing all of this, right? Knowing the negative effect of mistakes, both viewing mistakes as something to fear and the way you respond to mistakes, knowing the impact that has on your game, what can you do about this? Well, number one, you want to change the way you view mistakes. And number two, you want to change the way you react to mistakes. So let's talk about that first one. How can you view mistakes? Now, when I'm talking about viewing mistakes in a different way, it's not that we're going to go from not wanting to make mistakes to being ecstatic that you made mistakes. That's not at all what we're trying to do. But what we are trying to do is recognize that fearing mistakes is one of the most harmful things that you can do to yourself as a player. As soon as you start fearing mistakes and you start avoiding mistakes, your performance is going to do nothing but drop. You won't play as aggressively, you won't play as confidently, you won't play as freely simply because you are afraid of making mistakes. So it's not that you are wanting to make mistakes, it's not that you are happy about making mistakes, it's that you're recognizing the negative effect of fearing mistakes. So we have to take a different perspective when it comes to mistakes. And that different perspective is going to be accepting mistakes and most importantly, learning from mistakes. So what it means to accept mistakes is that going into a game or going into a practice even, you accept the fact that mistakes will happen. Now, once again, this doesn't mean you want mistakes, but it means we accept that it's going to happen. Now, this goes off of this idea of expectations. So if you expect yourself to be perfect going into a game, and then you make one mistake, what does that mistake signal to yourself? It signals to you that you were not perfect that game, you did not meet your expectations, therefore it's a bad game, and once again, therefore, it's a reason to get down on yourself. So simply because of feeling like you need to be perfect, feeling like you have to avoid all mistakes, that increases the chances of you responding poorly to mistakes. And so what we want to do is we want to reframe that expectation going into the game, which means you need to accept the possibility of mistakes. If we accept that mistakes will happen, we aren't as surprised when they do happen. But that doesn't mean you try to make mistakes. You still try to do everything you can to play well. But there's such a big difference between trying to play well and trying to avoid mistakes. When you don't accept mistakes and you say they're unacceptable, I have to avoid them at all costs, you play to avoid mistakes. When you say I accept mistakes, look, they're going to happen, they're part of the game, so now I'm going to play to succeed, you play freely and you end up playing better. And what's crazy about this is you end up making less mistakes, simply because you're not trying to avoid the mistake in the first place. So you want to accept that, okay, mistakes might happen. It's okay. I just need to play freely because I know that that's the only way for me to reduce the amount of mistakes I make. And the second part to this new approach or new view of mistakes is trying to learn from mistakes. So taking the mindset of, look, mistakes are a way for me to learn as a player. When I make mistakes, I'll learn, which we're going to talk about here in a second with that in the moment part. But I know that any mistake I make, if I can learn just one simple thing from it, I can become a better athlete as a result of that. So mistakes aren't something to fear. They're something that I can learn from, but most importantly, they're something that I understand are a natural part of the game. And I know that fearing mistakes is so much more harmful than making mistakes, because fearing mistakes leads to more mistakes. So accept mistakes and recognize that mistakes are a way to learn as a player. And that's how we start working on shifting the way you view mistakes in the first place. And now this brings me to the second part of this strategy. The second part is trying to change how you respond to mistakes in the first place. Now, if you start accepting the fact that mistakes will happen, like I said a second ago, that starts to reduce the unrealistic expectation you have that you need to make no mistakes and you need to play perfectly. So if you reduce that expectation right there, we're going to see you change the way that you respond to mistakes, because mistakes aren't something that completely signals to yourself, oh, I'm sucking today, I made one mistake, today's a terrible game. If we can change that, once again, that's going to reduce the reaction you have. But in addition to that, we also want to have some in-the-moment tools in place, like some count breathing, where you take a few deep breaths to try to reset yourself, paying attention to your self-talk after you make mistakes, to move past that mistake, to stop the negative self-talk loop, and to get yourself refocused. But the simplest start that I always like to use when it comes to managing mistakes in the moment is actually more about reframing your goal when it comes to responding to a mistake. So I don't know about you, but when I played and I made mistakes, the mistakes would replay in my mind over and over and over again. And the reason that they would replay in my mind is because I was thinking about how much I wish they hadn't have happened. As I thought about how much I wish the mistake hadn't have happened, what ended up happening inside my head is that I was not at all focused on the next play. So if I was standing out there at shortstop or third base and I just made an error and I was thinking about the last play, do you think that I was as focused and ready for that next ball to be hit to me? No, and that's where one mistake would turn into two mistakes and three mistakes simply because I wasn't able to move past the first mistake. So instead of thinking, I wish the previous mistake hadn't happened, we want to try to reframe this goal to, I'm going to make up for that mistake. Now, I'm not saying that you want to reframe it to a fearful goal of, oh, okay, I can't make any more mistakes. This is more so an aggressive mindset where you say, I made the mistake, now I'm going to make up for it. Whatever your sport is, if you say, now I'm going to make up for it, all of a sudden you are more focused and locked in for that next play. So going back to my example, if I had been able to say, look, now I'm going to make up for it. I'm going to make this next play. So I'm even more focused and ready for the next ball to be hit to me because of the mistake. So now all of a sudden a mistake, instead of causing me to be distracted, has actually created increased focus for me because I am determined now to make that next play. That simple shift is what I would suggest you start with right now. Instead of wishing that you hadn't made the mistake, put your foot down and say, I'm going to make up for this. Not, I can't make another mistake, but I'm going to make up for it by doing something good for my team. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to make a play. I'm going to get a basket. I'm going to play hard defense, whatever it might be. But the bottom line is, when you view mistakes as something to avoid, and then you react negatively to mistakes in the moment, this will drastically reduce your performance. It increases fear. It increases anxiety. It causes tense and timid play. Overall, you're going to see your performance level drop. So it's very important right now that you reframe the way you view mistakes in the first place, accept that they will happen, and then also take more of a learning approach to them. And then in the moment, reframe that goal from not saying, I wish I hadn't made the mistake, but instead say, I will make the next play. I'm going to make up for that mistake. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos each week on sports psychology and mental training. And if you're interested in learning more about one-on-one mental performance coaching or any of the programs that I offer, I've put links to those in the description below.